Hello, TheGammaRepeater. Reltic here again. I got what you were saying earlier about the logical consistency, but I was worried over a slightly different type of consistency than you had addressed. Your earlier example of omnipotence was of a single great-making property being leveraged against itself, the making of a rock too big to lift, for example, and how omnipotence is limited by logical consistency. Um, yeah, right, so that I was okay with. I was worrying at a somewhat different problem of the possibility of two great-making properties leveraged against each other. This was like the married bachelor you brought up. And we both agree that it's impossible, but we hadn't addressed which one gives way to the other. Either property is in itself coherent, but when you try to put them together, they just can't be combined. This is so what gives way? The married part or the bachelor part? We can discard or limit property A to allow B into the set, or do the same to B to allow A into the set. But having done one or the other, can we really say that the set with A is greater than one with B or vice versa? Or is each a trade-off, superior in some way and inferior in others? And in that case, is a maximal set even possible? Are there any maximally great properties that conflict with any others? That's another question. Again, I wasn't trying to change your mind about anything. I was trying to express my own doubts and confusions about what you were describing. Um, both in do I really understand what you're saying and do I personally believe it can be true. But we agreed that it's not central, and I think we should move beyond it. It's just that you put a lot of effort into avoiding and addressing this point, and I felt I should clarify what had happened there. Alright, so as for the interpretations I find despicable, let me give you a couple of examples here. First, imagine a Christian, and I won't try to differentiate between a true Christian and someone who simply identifies as Christian. I lack the authority to do so. So when I say Christian, I'm really meaning someone who claims to be a Christian, and I'm not examining that claim any further. Imagine a Christian who takes Jesus to be the exclusive route to salvation, to forgiveness for sins in the afterlife, and thus anyone who doesn't worship God or Jesus or some particular combination thereof is damned. I won't get into Trinitarian versus Unitarian debates way more detailed than we need to get into. Alright, so that interpretation of exclusivity of salvation only through those who worship properly, I'm okay with it. Not necessarily the underlying concept, but with someone reaching that interpretation, I'm okay with that. You can get that out of the Bible if you read it a particular way, and I won't criticize someone just for coming away with an interpretation I don't particularly like. But then imagine that this Christian takes away an imperative to convert by any and all means possible, the more extreme the better. Force of law, force of arms, verbal or physical abuse, ostracism, all of it's justified in the name of conversion away from other beliefs because of their interpretation. You can attach all sorts of ideas of moral turpitude to the person to be converted, to dehumanize them and justify or at least make excusable whatever extremes you adopt to achieve that. And this particular example of a Christian will read into their interpretation a sanction and a mandate. I don't think all or even most Christians are like this, but there are some out there who are like this. This is Charlemagne, bring Europe to God through conversion or through the sword. Another example. This, fortunately, isn't a personal story, but it's kind of halfway personal. This happened to someone from the Jewish side of my family, and I won't identify her to preserve her privacy. When she was 10 years old, a group of teenage boys from a nearby Christian private school raped her explicitly because she was Jewish and Jews had killed Jesus. This group of people took a message of selective salvation out of Jesus' teachings, where some people are set above others, and use this as justification for something that was utterly unjustifiable. Again, this isn't an indictment of all Christianity, not by a long shot, but it's an example of how particular ways of interpreting the Gospels and acting on those interpretations are utterly repugnant to me. Nevertheless, I agree that there's a strong basis in the Bible for an interpretation of Jesus as an accepting and compassionate individual, and it is to this interpretation that I am personally the most drawn. But still, I caution myself that this is just an interpretation. There are some passages that could be interpreted for or against this, and I'm biased into reading them in a way I like. I recognize that this bias can give me a skewed view of the character, that if I were more intellectually honest, let's say, that doesn't sound like the right word, but let's go with that, that I wouldn't be so quick to reach towards that particular interpretation. For example, in Matthew, the only one I've read all the way through, so I guess that's where I'm drawing my example from. A Canaanite comes to Jesus asking for her daughter to be healed, and Jesus needs a little bit of persuading before he'll heal someone who isn't a Jew. Now, I prefer to think of this as Jesus being mentally locked into a certain mission in ministering to the Jews, but then discovering he's in error and correcting that by embracing a more universal calling. So a moment of epiphany and growth for Jesus. That's an example I can really admire and strive to emulate, regardless of whether I believe in the divinity of Jesus, existence of God, or regardless of whether I believe this is entirely a work of fiction or utter historical fact. I can still admire and emulate it. But I could also, if I were so minded, interpret this story in a more vicious way. I could see it as Jesus berating the woman for asking for his help when she'd been born to the wrong race, and forcing her to debase herself, calling her people the dogs beneath the table before he'd heal her daughter. This is less admirable in my eyes. Or I could see it as less of an epiphany for Jesus and more of a lesson from him, where Jesus planned to heal her daughter all along, but first wanted to make a point to the disciples who were watching. I could also admire this message and character, but it doesn't carry the same applicability to my own state as a flawed individual seeking to improve. So I guess that just because I'm seeing a core character on display here, and I think we're in agreement about the nature of the character, at least so far as we've discussed, doesn't mean that it's the only thing that people can see, just because I see it that way, or even the right interpretation, if there is such a thing as a right interpretation. Something else I noticed is that when listing some of the interpretations I despised, that was less about the interpretation itself and more about the actions people chose to take based on the interpretation. The major premise rather than the minor, so to speak. Anyhow, I'm rambling, so I'll throw it back to you. I'm coming down with a cold. I've got that whole fuzzy-headed feeling going on. So yeah, enough of me talking. Hope to hear back from you.